Hello, my friends. Welcome back. Like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next video.
I've always loved the thrill of off-roading. The roar of the engine, the dirt flying, the isolation of the backwoods. It's an addiction, a rush that city life can't compete with. My buddies Mike and Jared were into it too, but they'd recently gotten tied up with work and family, so this time it was just me and my old Jeep Cherokee. I had heard about a trail deep in the Appalachian backcountry, a path so remote, even locals barely go near it. Some of them called it Whisper Hollow. The name alone gave me chills, but I was eager to push my limits. I started early, before sunrise, the sky a gradient of deep purples and cold blues. My phone's GPS was unreliable out here, so I printed an old trail map and marked the route. The first few miles were straightforward, gravel, rocks, and narrow turns, nothing I hadn't tackled before. Birds woke with the sun, and I felt that usual mix of freedom and isolation that I craved. About an hour in, the trail narrowed, winding through dense pine forests. I noticed how unnaturally quiet it had become. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing except the crunch of tires on gravel. The silence was thick, almost tangible, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Quiet trails weren't unusual, but my stomach started twisting. There was a faint, lingering scent in the air, something metallic, almost like iron, mixed with damp soil. I ignored it, thinking I was just overthinking. The Jeep hit a particularly muddy section, and I slid a little, the tires spinning as I struggled to gain traction. That's when I noticed it, a figure standing off to the side of the trail, partially obscured by trees. At first, I thought it was a hunter, maybe trying to flag me down. I slowed and leaned out the window. The figure didn't move, just stood there, arms limp at its sides. It looked wrong, its head tilted at an odd angle, like it wasn't really attached properly. A chill ran down my spine. I hit the gas and drove past without looking back, but the unease settled deep in my chest. By midday, the trail had deteriorated into ruts and rocks, barely passable. I pulled over to check the undercarriage, muttering curses at my luck. That's when I noticed the tire tracks in the mud beside the trail. I had seen them before, fresh and deep, two parallel lines like someone else had been here recently. But I knew I hadn't seen any other vehicles, and then I realized they weren't Jeep tracks. They were narrower, almost like something on foot, but staggered in an unnatural pattern, uneven like the person or thing was limping or maybe hopping. I shook my head and laughed nervously. I was alone, and my imagination was getting the better of me. I got back in the Jeep and tried to push forward, but that's when the trail seemed to change. It was subtle at first. The trees grew closer together, their shadows darker, blocking out sunlight. I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The map didn't make sense anymore. The twists and turns seemed exaggerated. I could swear I passed the same dead oak tree twice. A low fog began to rise, curling around the tires and clinging to the ground. My radio, which had been crackling with static the whole way, went completely silent. No music, no chatter, nothing. Even my phone displayed no signal. Panic began to set in, though I tried to suppress it. I've been in rough situations before, but there's a difference between being lost and being hunted. A thought that I immediately brushed aside crossed my mind. maybe I wasn't alone. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but deep down I knew better. Then came a sound. At first, I couldn't place it. A scraping, dragging noise from somewhere behind me. I froze, hand tightening on the steering wheel. My Jeep's tires crunched over gravel, but this noise didn't match my movement. I stopped completely and listened. There was again slow, deliberate scraping against the dirt and rocks. I turned the Jeep around slowly, heart hammering, scanning the fog-shrouded trail. Nothing. I told myself to keep moving, to get out of this fog, but every mile I drove, the feeling of being watched intensified. Shadows shifted oddly in the mist. I could have sworn I saw shapes moving just beyond the tree line, tall, thin, bending unnaturally. I shook my head and cursed myself for losing control of my mind. But that's when I noticed tire tracks again, parallel, narrow, staggered. They were following me. I tried to speed up, but my Jeep's engine hesitated, sputtering. The headlights flickered. My heart nearly stopped when I saw something move in front of me. A person, or something that resembled a person, standing in the middle of the trail. Pale skin, dark hair plastered to its face, clothes torn. I slammed the brakes, the tires skidding, and the figure didn't flinch. Its head tilted at that same wrong angle, like the figure was observing me in a way no human could. And then it moved. Not walking, not running. It just dropped to all fours and bounded toward me with impossible speed. I hit the gas, tires spinning, engine whining, and swerved through the trees. The fog thickened, and every turn I took seemed to loop back to the same area. That's when I realized I was trapped. The trail didn't lead anywhere anymore. Every familiar landmark was gone, replaced by twisted, warped versions of itself. I tried calling Mike, Jared, anyone, but there was no signal. I screamed into the phone, desperation clawing at me, but the only response was silence. Then I heard it behind me again, closer this time. The scraping sound, the unnatural gait. I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. The figure wasn't alone. Shadows stretched across the fog, dozens of them, tall and thin, moving in ways that made my brain reject them. They surrounded me, circling, never making a sound, but always there. I drove blindly trusting instinct. At one point, the Jeep hit a deep rut and I flipped it. I blacked out briefly, waking to find the vehicle on its side, engine still running, the world tilted. I climbed out, trembling, mud coating my clothes, and tried to orient myself. That's when I noticed the trees. They were all leaning toward me. Branches scratched at my arms like fingers, and the fog coiled closer, suffocating. I ran blindly, not caring where I was going. And that's when I saw a cabin. It wasn't on any map, just an old log structure, lights flickering inside. I thought it was salvation. I pounded on the door. No answer. I tried the handle. Unlocked. I stepped inside, relief flooding me, until I realized the room was empty. No furniture, just walls covered in scratches, deep gouges, and a circle of what looked like dried mud in the center. My eyes followed them, and I noticed footprints, too many footprints, leading straight toward the far corner, disappearing into the darkness. Then I felt it, the air change, cold, heavy, almost alive. Behind me, a sound, breathing, not human breathing, ragged, wet, echoing in the empty cabin. I spun around. Nothing. I ran to the door. The fog outside had thickened, rolling against the cabin like waves. I screamed, pounding on the walls, kicking anything. And then I heard the whisper. At first, I thought it was in my head, a faint hiss, repeating my name over and over. James! James! Soft, drawn out, chilling. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed. My own voice was swallowed by it, my cries absorbed by the oppressive darkness. And then I saw movement in the corner of my eye, shadows converging, growing taller, leaning toward me. I ran, and everything went black. When I woke, I was lying on the trail, the Jeep nowhere in sight. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest. My legs were scraped, clothes torn, and my hand was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I ran until I found a highway, hitching a ride into town. People stared, asked questions, but I couldn't tell them what happened. Who would believe me? I've never gone back. I haven't touched the Jeep since. Friends try to coax me into another off-road trip. I laugh it off, but at night, when I'm alone, I still see those shadows in my mind. The scraping, the whispering, the impossible figures. And sometimes when the wind blows just right, I hear it again. James! Calling me back. I'd always thought off-roading was just about mud, rocks, and adrenaline. But what I experienced that weekend made me question everything I thought I knew about being alone in the wilderness. I'm still not sure how to explain it. Some nights I can't sleep, and I swear I hear the sound of it again, the thing that followed me. It started on a Saturday morning. I had loaded up my Jeep Cherokee with supplies, extra fuel, a first aid kit, a couple of spare tires, snacks, and my trusted flashlight. The plan was simple: hit a new trail I'd heard about from a coworker, somewhere deep in the Ozarks, far from cell towers and other people. The trail was called Black Hollow Pass. There wasn't much information about it online, just a few forum posts warning of tricky terrain and rough weather. Perfect. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. I passed a couple of small towns, then the road narrowed into a dirt path lined with thick woods on both sides. The air smelled like wet pine and earth. The sun was shining through the canopy in beams, giving the forest an almost magical quality. I grinned, thinking about the off-road adventure ahead. At first, everything was normal. Rocks, roots, narrow turns. I'd navigated tougher trails. But about 2 hours in, the trail changed. The trees grew taller and closer, their branches intertwining overhead to create a tunnel-like effect. Shadows pooled along the ground, even though the sun was high. That's when I noticed something off. The trail seemed too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing except the sound of my tires crunching over dirt. I stopped for a moment to check the map, but that's when I saw it, a small, black figure darting between the trees. I thought it was a deer, but the way it moved didn't make sense. Too quick, too deliberate, almost intelligent. I blinked and it was gone. I shook my head and laughed nervously. "Get grip, James," I muttered. The trail got worse as the afternoon progressed. Rocks shifted under my tires, mud made me slide, and I had to crawl over fallen logs. My Jeep grunted under the strain. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered and died. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. My heart sank. I was deep in the forest with no service, and night would fall soon. I got out and tried to push the Jeep to a more level area. As I walked, I noticed tracks in the dirt. Not human or animal, something else. They were wide, irregular, almost like multiple limbs had pressed into the soil at once. My stomach twisted. I stared at them for a moment before a low snapping sound made me spin around. The woods were empty. The sun dipped lower and a fog began to settle. I decided to stay put and wait for dawn, thinking I could try to start the Jeep in daylight. I cleared some leaves and branches to make a small camp, but sleep didn't come. Every sound, the cracking of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made my nerves jolt. Hours passed. The fog thickened, reducing visibility to just a few feet. Then I saw it, or them. Shapes emerging from a mist, moving between the trees. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, fatigue and stress playing tricks, but the shadows were solid. Tall, impossibly thin, and moving in jerky, unnatural ways. They didn't run or walk. They twisted, contorted, and slithered across the ground as if gravity didn't affect them the same way it affected me. Panic set in. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the nearest figure. It stopped moving, just stared. I don't think it had eyes. There was something in the way it lingered that made my blood run cold, like it was studying me. I turned to run back to the Jeep, and that's when I realized I couldn't find it. Not the trail, not the path I came from. It was as if the forest had shifted, folding in on itself. I ran blindly, branches slapping my face, mud sucking at my boots. The shapes followed, but I never heard them make a sound. Just shadows, always at the edges of my vision. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing, and my heart nearly stopped. The clearing was circular, lined with tall, thin trees that seemed to bend inward, like the forest itself was alive and watching me. In the center was an abandoned truck, rusted and overturned, half buried in mud. I approached cautiously. The truck door creaked open as if inviting me in. Inside, everything was coated in dust, but there were strange symbols scratched into the metal. Patterns I didn't recognize, twisting shapes that made my skin crawl. And then I saw it, something crouched in the back seat. At first, it looked human, a man maybe, but its limbs were too long, elbows bending the wrong way. Its head lolled to the side, and its eyes reflected my flashlight in a way no human could. I stumbled back, tripping over a root. That's when the fog in the clearing thickened into a wall, moving with purpose. I turned to run, and the shadows and the fog stretched toward me, reaching with impossibly long arms. I screamed, adrenaline fueling my legs, and bolted. I ran for hours. I have no idea how long. The trail kept looping back, always ending at the clearing, always at the truck, always with the shapes waiting. Each time I approached the clearing, the truck would shift slightly, as if it had moved while I wasn't looking. The symbols scratched into the metal seemed to rearrange themselves, and the thing in the back seat, it changed too. Sometimes crouched, sometimes standing impossibly tall, watching me. I started to realize I wasn't just lost. I was trapped. trapped in a part of the forest that didn't obey normal rules. Time didn't pass normally. I rationed my water and food, but eventually I had to stop. My body ached. My mind screamed for escape. Then I noticed something. The trees, the fog, even the truck, they weren't solid. If I focused too hard, the edges of everything wavered like heat ripples over pavement. That's when I understood, whatever this was, it wasn't natural. The forest itself was alive, or worse, sentient, and it didn't like me. Desperation drove me to try something reckless. I climbed into the truck. The door barely closed behind me. Inside, I found a journal, pages yellowed and damp. It belonged to someone who had been trapped here before me. The handwriting was frantic. They are everywhere. They move the trees. The clearing, it's a doorway. The forest doesn't want you to leave. It feeds on fear. Don't let it see you. Don't look. The final page was torn. I didn't read more. I could feel the presence now, pressing in through the thin metal walls. My heart raced. I started the truck. It roared to life as if the engine understood my fear. I slammed it in gear and floored the accelerator. The trail seemed to stretch infinitely. Shadows appeared on all sides, but I didn't look. I just drove. Hours must have passed. The fog thinned, trees began to look normal, and eventually, I saw a clearing with sunlight breaking through. I didn't slow until I reached a familiar dirt road leading to civilization. I never returned to Black Hollow Pass. I sold the Jeep. I avoid off-roading now, avoid forests entirely. But sometimes, in dreams, I'm back there. The truck waits. The symbols scratch themselves into my mind, and I can hear the whispers just at the edge of hearing calling me back. No one believes me, and maybe that's for the best. But I know the truth. The forest is alive. It moves. It watches. Because once you enter Black Hollow Pass, it doesn't just let you leave. It keeps you. I've always had a love-hate relationship with off-roading. There's a freedom to it, a sense that the world belongs to you for a few hours, and that's why I did it alone that weekend. No friends, no cell service, just me and my old lifted Ford F-150 tackling the backcountry trails outside of Hocking Hills, Ohio. I'd heard whispers of an abandoned logging trail deep in the forest, one locals refused to discuss. Some called it Devil's Ridge. It was perfect for testing my skills, or so I thought. The morning started sunny, almost idyllic. Mist hovered over the treetops as I rolled down the windows, letting the smell of wet pine fill the cab. My map was marked with the faint traces of previous explorers, mostly warnings. I shrugged, thinking it was just rustic exaggeration. I'd been in worse places and survived. The first hour was typical trail riding. Rocks, roots, puddles. Birds chirped, squirrels darted, the occasional deer crossed my path. I felt that rush of solitude that I always craved, the thrill of being completely untethered. But then I reached a narrow passage where the trees grew impossibly close, branches forming a tunnel over the trail. Shadows pooled unnaturally on the ground, despite the sun shining through the leaves. I slowed, a chill crawling down my spine, but the trail ahead looked passable. That's when the Ford died. Just cut out. No sputtering, no warning. I tried the ignition. Nothing. Heart pounding, I climbed out. The air felt thick, almost viscous. I looked around. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just oppressive stillness. I tapped the hood, muttering under my breath. A rational mind would tell me engines fail all the time, but this felt different. I opened the back to check my supplies. My backpack was there, but the straps were twisted as if someone or something had rummaged through it. I froze. Nothing moved. Then I heard it, a faint scraping coming from somewhere deeper in the trees. I turned sharply. Shadows danced between the trunks, just beyond the edge of vision. I told myself it was a deer or a falling branch, but instinct screamed at me to run. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking the trail toward what I hoped was an exit. Mud sucked at my boots, and every step seemed heavier than the last. That's when I noticed footprints. Not human, too elongated, too narrow, with uneven spacing. They looked as if whatever made them had several joints in its legs, bending in impossible ways. The footprints were fresh, leading in the same direction I was going. As I walked, the forest changed. The trees grew taller, trunks warped in impossible angles. The trail bent in ways that made no sense, looping back on itself. Every time I thought I recognized a landmark, it would vanish. The fog began to roll in, thick and gray, reducing visibility to a few feet. That's when I saw the first one. It crouched near a tree, barely noticeable at first. Pale, elongated limbs, and a head that tilted at a way no human neck should. Its eyes, or the hollows where I should have been, locked on me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew it was studying me. I froze, flashlight shaking in my hand. Why dare to blink? It was gone. Panic set in. I ran blindly, trying to find the trail, but the forest twisted around me. Every step seemed to lead me deeper, not out. Then came the whispers. At first, it was just a breeze through the leaves, or so I told myself. But the whispers became distinct words, calling my name, taunting me. James, James, don't leave. I spun around, but no one was there. Only fog and impossible shadows. Hours passed. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraping my arms and legs. I tried shouting for help, my voice swallowed by the thick air. Eventually, I collapsed near a fallen tree, exhausted and trembling. That's when I noticed the ground beneath me moving. Not shifting naturally, but like something was crawling under the leaves, following me. The mud bubbed slightly. A branch snapped. I screamed and bolted, running faster than I ever thought possible. I saw a faint glimmer ahead, an old cabin, dilapidated, half hidden by trees. Desperate, I ran to it, hoping for shelter or at least a landmark I could remember. The door creaked open, inviting. Inside, it was empty, just dust and old tools. But in the center of the floor was a circle, carved into the wood, surrounded by symbols I didn't recognize. My flashlight flickered, and I could swear shadows were writhing along the walls. Then I heard movement behind me. Slow, deliberate. I spun, but nothing was there. The cabin felt alive, the air thickening. I could smell decay, copper, and wet soil. Something whispered again, closer this time. You can't leave. I backed toward the door, trying to keep my flashlight on the floor. Shadows twisted toward me, no longer at the edges of vision, but directly in front, almost tangible. I ran out, crashing through underbrush, branches slapping my face. The forest itself seemed to push back, roots tripping me, fog thickening. The shapes followed, sometimes glimpsed in the fog, sometimes in the corner of my eye. They never ran, never made a noise, but I felt their gaze, their intent. Finally, I stumbled upon a river. The current was strong and the banks muddy, but I waded in, hoping water would hide my scent. The fog hung low over the surface. I clambered along the far bank, hoping to find a road. Hours later, exhausted and soaked, I finally saw tire tracks, a dirt road barely visible. Salvation. I followed the tracks for miles, not daring to look back. Eventually, I reached a paved road and flagged down a car. The driver stared at me as I collapsed into the seat, covered in mud, shaking, muttering about shapes and whispers. I don't know if he believed me. I never returned to that trail. I sold the Jeep, swore off off-roading entirely. But sometimes at night, I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the whispers, seeing the shadows at the edge of my vision. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was stress, fatigue, or imagination. But I know the truth. There's something out there, deep in the forest, something that doesn't obey logic or physics, something that moves and watches. And I know that if I ever go back, it will be waiting. I've always loved the freedom of off-roading, the way the mud splashes, the tires churn over rocks and roots, the complete isolation from the rest of the world. It's intoxicating. But I learned that weekend that some roads are better left unexplored. Some trails are not meant to be conquered, and some fears are not meant to be faced. It was early September when I set out. I had spent weeks preparing, checking the Jeep, packing extra fuel, food, water, and my camping gear. The trail I aimed for was called Crow Hollow, a remote path tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. There were rumors about it, whispered on forums and local blogs, stories of hikers disappearing or hearing things in the night. I laughed them off. I wasn't a kid anymore, and I wasn't superstitious. The drive to the trailhead was serene, almost peaceful. Mist clung to the treetops, birds called softly, and the morning sunlight flickered through the leaves. By the time I hit the dirt trail, the world behind me had vanished. Only me, the Jeep, and the thick woods ahead. The first few miles were straightforward, though narrow, with a few tricky curves and rocks. After a couple of hours, I noticed the trail changing. The trees grew unnaturally close together, branches intertwining to form a dense canopy. The air was cooler, heavier, and the forest fell silent. No birds, no insects, not even a breeze rustling the leaves. I slowed, uneasy but trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then I saw the first sign something was wrong. A tree, huge and old, leaned over the trail, and carved into its bark was a message. Turn back. I laughed nervously, taking it as the work of pranksters. But as I drove past, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A figure crouched low, pale, and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. When I blinked, it was gone. I ignored it, pressing onward, but the further I drove, the more the trail changed. What should have been an open path narrowed into a maze of twisted roots and rocks. with sudden drops and hidden ditches. The GPS went haywire, flipping between coordinates, showing roads that didn't exist. That's when I realized I was completely lost. By late afternoon, the sky had dimmed. I decided to set up a temporary camp, hoping I could fix the Jeep in the morning. That's when I noticed something that froze my blood. Tire tracks in the mud surrounding my Jeep. Not my own, and not the pattern of any vehicle I recognized. They were narrow, jagged, and looked as though whatever left them had moved in bursts, like a predator stalking prey. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the pattern of the tracks suggested more than that. They circled my Jeep, disappeared into the trees, then reappeared closer. Something was watching. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix the Jeep. Nothing worked. By the time night fell, I had no choice but to sleep in the Jeep. I wrapped myself in my jacket and tried to block out the oppressive silence. That's when I heard it, faint scratching sounds from just outside the vehicle. The scratching grew louder, circling the Jeep, then stopped abruptly. Silence. Hours passed. I slept fitfully, jerking awake at every small noise. Then, just before dawn, I saw them, figures emerging from the fog. Tall, skeletal, impossibly thin, with limbs bending in ways that made my stomach turn. They didn't run. They didn't make a sound. They just moved in slow, jerking motions surrounding the Jeep, peering through the windows with hollow eyes. I couldn't think. I panicked, fumbling with the keys. Finally, the Jeep roared to life. I slammed it into gear and bolted down the trail, tires spinning over mud and rocks. But no matter how fast I drove, the forest seemed to bend around me, looping me back toward the same spot. The figures followed, appearing between trees, at the edge of the fog, always closer. I don't know how long I drove. Hours, maybe more. Eventually, I saw a faint light ahead, a clearing, or maybe a road. I pushed forward. But as I approached, the ground opened into a pit I hadn't seen before. I tried to brake, but the Jeep skidded, tumbling down the incline. I blacked out. When I woke, I was lying on the trail, the Jeep gone. The forest was empty, eerily quiet. I stumbled, weak and disoriented, toward what I hoped was civilization. Eventually, I found a narrow road and flagged down a passing truck. I tried to explain, but my words seemed nonsensical even to me. I never returned to Crow Hollow. I've avoided off-roading since. Nights are worse. I dream of the forest bending, the figures stalking me, the whispers calling my name. People tell me it was a hallucination, stress, fatigue. But I know the truth. Something lives there, something that doesn't belong to the world we know. And I know, without a doubt, that if I ever go back, it will find me again. I've always thought of myself as someone who can handle the wilderness. Growing up in Ohio, weekends in the woods were normal. Campfires, dirt trails, and the occasional broken-down Jeep. But nothing I'd ever done prepared me for what I faced that weekend. I'm still not sure if what happened was real. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, and I swear I can hear it moving outside my window, even though I live in the middle of a small town. It started on a Saturday morning. I had loaded my old Jeep Cherokee with everything I could think of: extra fuel, water, snacks, a sleeping bag, and my trusty flashlight. The trail I was heading for was called Raven's Run, deep in the West Virginia mountains. I'd heard about it from an old off-road forum, mostly stories about people getting lost or seeing things at night. I laughed them off. I'm not superstitious. I have a Jeep, a GPS, and common sense. The first part of the drive was beautiful. Morning mist clung to the treetops, and sunlight pierced the canopy in golden beams. I was relaxed, smiling, feeling that familiar rush of freedom I get when I'm alone in the woods. But soon, the trail narrowed and the forest grew dense. The canopy above thickened until it blocked most of the sunlight, and the world seemed to shrink around me. I should have turned back. Instead, I pressed on. The trail soon became rougher. Roots snaked across the dirt, mud patches sucked at the tires, and rocks jutted out unpredictably. That's when I noticed the first strange thing: footprints in the mud. They weren't human. Too long, too narrow, and oddly spaced, like the thing that made them had multiple joints in its legs. The footprints didn't follow a straight line. They curved, twisted, sometimes overlapping each other. I froze. My mind tried to rationalize it. A chill ran down my spine. By late afternoon, the trail had deteriorated completely. My GPS was useless, flipping between coordinates like it was possessed. As I set up a small camp, the air seemed to shift. The forest went silent. No birds, no wind, nothing except the occasional snap of a branch beneath the weight of some unseen animal. That's when I saw the shapes. At first, they were just shadows flitting between the trees, just beyond the edge of my vision. I thought it was fatigue. But then I saw one clearly, tall, thin, and wrong. Its limbs were elongated, elbows bent the wrong way, head tilting at impossible angles. Its eyes, were the dark hollows where eyes should be, fixed on me. It didn't move like a person. It moved like a puppet, jerky and unnatural. I froze. It disappeared when I blinked. Hours passed. Darkness fell. The forest felt alive, pressing in on me. Then came the whispers, faint at first, almost a trick of the wind, then louder, distinct. James! James, come closer. I spun, flashlight swinging wildly, but the forest was empty. Panic set in. I packed up my camp and decided to drive, but the trail seemed to have disappeared. The trees twisted, curving around me, leading me back to the same spot over and over, and the shadows followed. They didn't run. They didn't chase. They just moved with me, appearing at the edges of my vision, then disappearing, then appearing again, always closer. Hunger and exhaustion blurred time. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold: an abandoned cabin. The wood was rotted, the windows dark, but a faint glow emanated from inside. The cabin door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, everything was coated in dust. On the floor, a circle had been drawn in ash, filled with symbols I didn't recognize. The walls were scratched with strange runes. And in the corner, something crouched. At first, it looked human. Then I saw the limbs too long, elbows bending wrong, fingers tipped with sharp points. Its head swiveled toward me. Hollow, black eyes locked on mine. I screamed and stumbled back outside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the forest seemed to change. The trees bent inward, the fog thickened, and the shadows closed in. I ran blindly, branches slapping my face, roots tripping me, mud pulling at my boots. The figures followed, always following, always watching. Finally, I stumbled into a stream. The current was swift, icy. I moved downstream until I saw a narrow dirt road. I ran to it, exhausted, collapsing when I saw headlights approaching. A truck stopped. I stumbled in, covered in mud, shaking, bleeding from scratches and bruises. I never returned to Raven's Run. I've avoided off-roading entirely since that day. Some nights, though, I dream of the forest bending, of the shadows stalking me, of whispers calling my name. I know the truth. Something lives there, something that moves in the dark, waiting for the next person foolish enough to drive down that trail. And I know, without a doubt, if I ever go back, it will find me again. I've always loved the idea of being alone in the wilderness, off the beaten path where no one can reach you. That's what drew me to off-roading in the first place. My friends always teased me for going out by myself, but I liked the solitude, the challenge, the feeling that the world was mine for a few hours. But that weekend changed everything I thought I knew about isolation, about what's real and what's not. It began on a Friday afternoon. I had packed my Jeep with supplies, extra fuel, water, food, a first aid kit, and a sleeping bag. I wasn't planning a long trip, just a night or two on a trail called Widow's Creek, tucked deep in the West Virginia backwoods. It was supposed to be a challenging route, rocky, steep, and rarely traveled. There were a few mentions online of people getting uneasy out there, but nothing concrete. I figured it was just folklore, local color. I was wrong. The first hour of the trail was exhilarating. The Jeep climbed over rocks, splashed through puddles, and I grinned, feeling the thrill of the engine beneath me. But then I noticed the forest growing quiet. Not normal quiet, the kind you get when a few birds stop singing. This was deep, unnatural silence, the kind that make your skin crawl. I slowed the Jeep, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it. A tree twisted unnaturally, its trunk curved almost at a right angle. Hanging from a branch, there was a tattered jacket, old, faded, and caked in dirt, swaying gently despite the lack of wind. My stomach sank. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter left it there. Maybe it was an old prank. The trail got worse. Rocks scraped the underside of my Jeep. Roots tangled the tires. I had to use the winch to get over a fallen tree. Every step felt heavier than the last, and I started noticing strange things. Scratches on tree trunks, symbols etched into bark that didn't resemble anything I knew. Some looked like letters, others like arrows pointing down the trail. I didn't know why, but they made my skin prickle. By evening, I found a small clearing and decided to make camp. I set on my sleeping bag, prepped some food, and sat quietly. That's when I first heard the whispering. Faint, almost inaudible. I froze. It sounded like someone calling my name, barely audible over the wind. James! James! I told myself it was the trees, the wind through the branches. I laughed nervously and tried to ignore it. I went to sleep in the Jeep, keeping the doors locked, but I didn't sleep. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. Every time I dared to look outside, the shadows of the trees seemed to shift unnaturally. Shapes moved in the darkness, tall and thin, bending in ways that made no sense. When I woke in the middle of the night, something had changed. The forest seemed alive. The trees leaned closer, almost as if they were watching. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. That's when I noticed footprints circling my Jeep. Not human, not animal, something else. Too narrow, elongated, with uneven spacing, like it had multiple limbs. The prints stopped abruptly near the Jeep, as if whatever left them had been studying me. I tried the Jeep again in the morning. Nothing. The engine wouldn't turn over. My phone had no signal. I had no choice but to continue on foot, hoping to find another trail. I followed the faint path, but the trees twisted, branches forming walls, the forest folding in on itself. I started to realize I wasn't just lost, I was trapped. By midday, the temperature dropped and a thick fog rolled in. Visibility dropped to a few feet. And that's when I saw them, figures emerging from the fog, not human. Tall, skeletal, with limbs bent wrong, heads tilting at impossible angles. They didn't move like humans. They didn't make a sound. But they followed me, always at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I turned, then appearing again, closer. Panic overtook me. I ran blindly, tripping over roots, slipping in mud, scraping my arms and legs. The trail seemed endless, looping back on itself. Each time I thought I found the way out, I returned to the same clearing. In the center, I saw a cabin I hadn't noticed before. Its wood was rotted, the windows dark, yet faint light flickered inside. Desperate, I ran toward it. Inside, the cabin smelled of rot and decay. Dust covered every surface. In the center of the floor, a circle had been etched, surrounded by symbols I didn't recognize. Shadows seemed to move along the walls, elongating, twisting, almost alive. In the corner, crouched on all fours, was something humanoid. At first, I thought it was a person. Then I saw the limbs, the head tilting unnaturally, the hollow eyes. I screamed and stumbled back outside. The forest itself seemed to pulse around me, trees bending inward, fog thickening, shapes advancing. I ran blindly. Roots tripped me. Mud sucked at my boots. I stumbled into a shallow creek, water up to my knees. I ran along the bank, hoping to escape the shapes, hoping to find a road. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. Eventually, I saw headlights. A truck drove slowly toward me. I flagged it down, collapsing into the seat, covered in mud, blood, and sweat. The driver didn't say much, just stared as I muttered incoherently about shapes, whispers, and a cabin. He dropped me at the nearest town. I never returned to Widow's Creek. I sold the Jeep. I quit off-roading entirely. But some nights I wake in a cold sweat, hearing the whispers, seeing the shadows at the edge of my vision. No one believes me. I don't blame them. But I know the truth. The forest is alive. It moves. It watches. And one day, if I'm careless, it will come for me again. I've always been drawn to the backcountry, the places most people avoid. The allure of a remote trail, a river cutting through untouched woods, and the roar of an engine bouncing over rocks. There's nothing like it. That's why I found myself driving alone along Black Pine Ridge, a trail in the Smoky Mountains that locals whispered about but rarely visited. They said it was dangerous, but I didn't care. Danger, after all, was part of the thrill. The first few miles were easy. The trail wound through towering pines and open clearings, the sun filtering through the needles. I grinned as the Jeep bounced over a rocky incline, feeling that familiar rush. I've been off-roading many times, but there was something about Black Pine Ridge that felt different, older, wiser. As if the forest itself was aware I was there. It started subtly. I noticed small things first. A tree leaned at a strange angle, its trunk twisted as though in pain. A rock formation seemed oddly symmetrical, unnaturally so, like someone had placed it there. I told myself it was imagination, fatigue from the drive, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. By midday, the trail became narrower. Roots snaked across the path, mud slicked the rocks, and the Jeep groaned as I navigated a particularly tricky incline. That's when I saw it, tire tracks in the mud that weren't mine. At first, I thought maybe another off-roader had passed through, but the tracks were narrow, staggered, almost as if something with multiple legs had left them. The deeper I went, the more tracks appeared, crisscrossing the trail, some stopping abruptly. Unease settled into my chest. I shook it off and pressed on. But as afternoon approached, the trail began to feel wrong. I passed the same tree twice. A rock that I swore was to my left appeared on my right. I stopped, looking around, and realized the forest had thickened unnaturally. The canopy blocked out the sun, turning the woods dark, even though it was still early. Then came the whispering. At first, it was faint, like the wind moving through the trees. Then it became words distant but clear. Turn back, leave, don't follow. I froze, heart hammering. I called out, hello? Is anyone there? The only reply was silence. My rational mind screamed that it was the wind, but a primal part of me knew better. I pressed forward, more cautiously now. The trail twisted and turned, each corner revealing something new. A tree with deep scratches along its bark, a patch of mud that looked freshly churned. My Jeep struggled over a fallen log, and when I climbed out to clear it, I noticed something that made my stomach knot. Handprints smeared in mud on the log, large, elongated, too thin for a human hand. Night fell fast. The darkness was thick, swallowing the trail whole. I decided to stop and camp. I set up a small fire, but even the fire seemed weak, its light barely reaching past the edges of the clearing. That's when I saw movement, shadows flitting between the trees, just beyond the firelight. But then I heard the scraping, slow, deliberate, coming from all around. Not on the ground. It was above, the sound of claws on wood. I looked up and froze. The branches overhead twisted as if something was moving through them. Impossible silhouettes sliding silently between the treetops. Hours passed in tense silence. I dare not sleep. Then I saw them, figures emerging from the fog. Tall, thin, contorted, with limbs bending in ways that made my mind reject them. They didn't run or walk. They glided, jerking unnaturally, always keeping pace with the Jeep. Their eyes, or the hollows where eyes should be, locked on me, unblinking, relentless. I tried to drive faster, but the trail refused to obey. Curves looped back, and I realized with dawning horror that I was trapped. No matter how far I drove, I ended up back at the same twisted clearing. Desperation overtook reason. I abandoned the Jeep and ran. I stumbled through thick fog until I came across a ruined shack, rotted and leaning. I ran inside, hoping for shelter, but found the interior empty, except for scratches and symbols on the walls. Then I saw it crouched in the corner. At first, it seemed human. Then I noticed the limbs, the head, the way it moved. It was wrong. Its skin was pale, stretched, and its eyes were black voids. It tilted its head toward me, jerking unnaturally. I bolted, crashing through the door. Outside, the fog thickened, figures emerging, surrounding me. I ran blindly, sliding down a slope, tripping over roots and rocks. The forest seemed endless, a maze with no exit. Eventually, I saw a glimmer of light, a paved road. I ran toward it, collapsing into the arms of a passing driver. He stared at me as I muttered incoherently about figures, shadows, and a trail that refused to end. I never returned to Black Pine Ridge. I sold the Jeep. I stopped off-roading entirely. But the memory never leaves me. Some nights, I wake in a cold sweat, hearing whispers, seeing shadows. I know the truth. The forest is alive. It watches. It waits. Some trails are not meant to be traveled. Some roads, once entered, never truly release you. I learned that the hard way. I've always loved exploring off-the-beaten-path trails, where few people go and even fewer survive the isolation without their nerves unraveling. I had been warned about the Mill Hollow Trail in northern Georgia. Locals whispered about it online. Stories of hikers getting lost, people seeing strange shadows, and vehicles disappearing without a trace. But that kind of reputation only drew me in. I was eager to test my Jeep, my skills, and my courage. I set out early on a Friday, loaded down with supplies, extra fuel, water, a couple of spare tires, a sleeping bag, and my backpack. The first few miles were scenic and peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the thick trees, the dirt trail winding past rocks and shallow streams. I felt exhilarated, bouncing over roots and dodging fallen branches. It was everything I loved about off-roading: freedom, solitude, and the thrill of the unknown. The trail started to change as I ascended. Rocks became jagged, roots tangled across the path, and the canopy closed overhead, letting only thin shafts of sunlight reach the ground. I felt a creeping unease, a sense that I was being watched, but I shrugged it off as paranoia. I'd driven harder trails than this before. Then I saw the first sign something was wrong. A tree leaned at a violent angle, almost collapsing onto the trail. Carved into its bark were letters, deep scratches spelling, "Turn back." I laughed nervously, assuming it was some teenager's prank, but as I drove past, movement flickered between the trees, slender, shadowy figures darting behind trunks. I blinked and they were gone. The afternoon light began to fade as I climbed higher. The trail narrowed to a single lane, mud sucking at my tires, rocks catching the undercarriage. I navigated carefully, but my GPS started acting up. The signal flickered, coordinates jumped around, and trails appeared and disappeared on the screen. A knot formed in my stomach. Something about the place didn't want me there. By late afternoon, I came across a small clearing. I thought it would be the perfect spot to rest, check my supplies, and possibly camp if needed. That's when I noticed footprints circling the Jeep. They weren't human or animal, too narrow, elongated, and irregularly spaced. It looked like they had been pacing, watching, studying me. I felt panic rising, but tried to remain rational. I loaded my gear back into the Jeep and drove cautiously along the trail. That's when I heard it, the whispering, faint at first, almost like the wind calling my name. Chris, Chris, come closer. I froze. No one was there. The voice came again, louder, almost commanding. My pulse raced. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, stress, fatigue. I pressed on, but the trail became treacherous. Muddy inclines, fallen logs, and rocks blocked the way. I had to use the Jeep's winch to pull myself over a particularly steep patch. Each time I looked back, I thought I saw figures flitting at the edges of my vision, tall, thin, limbs bending in ways no human body should. They didn't chase, they didn't make noise, but I could feel their gaze. Night fell, bringing a thick fog that swallowed the trail. I realized I was lost. My GPS showed trails that didn't exist, trees seemed to shift, and every path I took led me back to the same dense patch of woods. I abandoned the idea of camping in the open and decided to keep moving, hoping to find an exit. Then I saw the cabin. It appeared suddenly, almost out of nowhere. Rotting wood, a sagging roof, windows dark but glowing faintly. Desperation drove me inside. Dust covered the floor, broken furniture lay scattered, and symbols were scratched into the walls. In the corner, crouched in shadows, was something that looked human, but wrong. Its limbs were impossibly long, joints bending backward, and its head tilted unnaturally. Its hollow eyes focused on me. I bolted outside. The fog thickened immediately, shadows moving closer. The forest seemed alive, branches grabbing, roots tripping me. I ran blindly, slipping in mud, scratches tearing my arms and legs. The trail twisted in ways that made no sense, leading me in loops back to the cabin, over and over. Exhausted, I stumbled into a creek, water up to my knees, icy and fast. I followed its bank, hoping to find a road. Figures emerged from the fog on both sides, moving silently, jerking unnaturally, watching. I didn't dare look directly at them, just kept running along the creek. Hours later, or maybe longer, I stumbled onto an overgrown dirt road. My heart leapt. I followed it until I saw a pair of headlights. I waved frantically. The truck slowed, and I collapsed into the passenger's seat, covered in mud, blood, and sweat, shaking, babbling incoherently about shadows, whispers, and the cabin. I never returned to Mill Hollow. I sold my Jeep. I quit off-roading. I tried to convince myself it was stress, hallucinations, fatigue. But I know the truth. The forest is alive. It moves. It watches. Some trails are not meant to be traveled. Some roads, once entered, never truly release you. I learned that the hard way. I thought I knew what off-roading meant: mud, rocks, steep inclines, and the occasional thrill. I had done it alone dozens of times, and it had always been exhilarating, never terrifying. But that weekend on Hollow Creek Trail changed everything. I can't explain exactly why, but from the moment I turned off the paved road and onto the gravel path, I knew I was stepping into something different, something alive. It started in the late morning. My Jeep was loaded with supplies: water, extra gas, a toolkit, a flashlight, and some food. Hollow Creek was supposed to be remote but scenic. Rocky ridges, clearings with streams, and overlooks that gave you a view of miles of untouched forest. The first hour went smoothly. The trail twisted through pines and oaks, sunbeams dancing on the dirt. I was alone, and I loved it. But then I noticed the trees growing denser, their branches forming an almost solid wall above the trail. Shadows pooled unnaturally, and the birds had vanished. I slowed the Jeep. The forest felt aware. I laughed at myself, thinking it was nerves, but the feeling didn't go away. Soon, the trail narrowed, roots weaving across the path, rocks jutting out unpredictably. I had to crawl over a fallen log using the winch. That's when I noticed the footprints in the mud. Not human, not animal. They were long, narrow, irregularly spaced, almost as if the creature that made them moved in bursts, like it was stalking. I tried to ignore it, but the unease kept growing. I was halfway up the ridge when my GPS went haywire. It spun, then froze, then showed trails that didn't exist. The trail behind me disappeared into the trees as if I had never been there. Panic bubbled, but I told myself I could figure it out. By late afternoon, the light had dimmed, the forest closing in. The air grew thick and damp, making it hard to breathe. That's when I heard it, whispering, low at first, barely audible, then more distinct. "Don't leave, don't leave." I froze, heart pounding. There was no wind. No one was there. The whispers persisted, almost commanding, growing louder, repeating my name. I abandoned any thought of resting. I drove slowly, scanning the edges of the trail, but the forest seemed to shift around me. The same tree appeared multiple times. A rock formation I had passed earlier was now ahead. My Jeep struggled through the mud, the engine groaning as though the forest itself was resisting my passage. Night came suddenly. A dense fog rolled in, swallowing the trail. Then I saw them, shapes flitting in the mist just beyond the headlights. Tall, thin, limbs bending at unnatural angles, moving jerkily, silently. Their faces, or the voids where faces should have been, stared at me. I slammed my foot on the gas, but every path I tried led back to the same clearing. The shapes followed, closer each time. Desperate, I abandoned the Jeep and ran on foot. Roots snagged my boots, mud clung to my legs, and the fog thickened. I stumbled through the forest, the whispering growing more urgent. Then I saw it, a small cabin, almost hidden in the dense trees. The roof sagged, windows dark, walls etched with symbols I didn't recognize. I ran inside, seeking refuge. Dust choked the air. And then I noticed it crouched in a corner. It looked human at first, then I saw the limbs elongated and twisted, the head tilting at an impossible angle. Its eyes were black voids, hollow and unblinking. The creature shifted toward me, jerking in movements that made no sense. I bolted outside. Immediately, the forest seemed to close in around me. Fog thickened, trees bent, and more shapes emerged from the darkness. I ran blindly, stumbling into a creek, water up to my knees. The icy current tore my legs, but I didn't stop. I must have run for hours. Exhaustion, fear, and hypothermia blurred my senses. Eventually, I saw a faint light, a narrow dirt road. I flagged down a truck. I collapsed into the passenger's seat, covered in mud, blood, and scratches, muttering incoherently. The driver stared silently. I never returned to Hollow Creek Trail. I sold my Jeep and quit off-roading entirely. But sometimes when the night is quiet, I hear the whispering again. I see shadows at the edges of my vision. I know the truth. The forest is alive. It doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. Somewhere deep in the woods, it waits. And if I ever go back, I know it will find me again. I've been itching for a weekend alone in the woods for months. After a brutal week at work, I needed the solitude only off-roading could give me. My Jeep was packed with supplies, extra fuel, tools, a sleeping bag, water, and enough food for 2 days. I had scouted a trail called Widow's Bluff in northeastern Tennessee. According to the forums, it was challenging, remote, and rarely traveled. Some of the locals warned me against it, muttering vague stories of people vanishing or hearing things they couldn't explain, but I wasn't superstitious. I had my Jeep, my experience, and enough survival instincts to get through any trail. Or so I thought. The first few miles were serene. The trail wound through pines and oaks, a canopy above filtering sunlight in golden streams. Birds sang, squirrels darted along branches, and a nearby creek gurgled over smooth stones. I felt alive, exhilarated by the challenge, and relaxed in the quiet isolation. But soon the trail became narrower, the trees closing in. The light dimmed under the dense canopy, and the air thickened, heavy and almost tangible. That's when I noticed it. A tree leaned sharply over the trail, and the bark was carved with the words, "Turn back." I laughed uneasily, thinking some kid had left it as a prank. But as I passed, I caught movement at the edge of my vision. Something thin, pale, and unnaturally tall, standing motionless between two trees. When I blinked, it was gone. I shrugged it off and pressed on. The trail deteriorated rapidly. Jagged rocks, tangled roots, and mud puddles that threatened to swallow my tires. At one point, a fallen log blocked the path, and I had to use my winch to get over it. The further I went, the more I noticed oddities. Small piles of stones arranged in patterns, scratches on tree trunks that looked like symbols, and footprints in the mud. Not human, not animal. Long, narrow, and spaced in a way that suggested whatever made them move differently from any living creature I had ever seen. By late afternoon, the forest was thick and oppressive. My GPS started acting strangely, coordinates jumping and roads appearing that didn't exist. I was completely disoriented. I knew I needed to find a safe spot to camp before night fell. I spotted a small clearing and set up my gear. That's when the first whispers began. Faint, almost inaudible, calling my name. Ethan, Ethan. I froze. No wind, no one nearby. My heart raced, but I tried to rationalize it. Stress, fatigue, or maybe wildlife. Hours passed. Darkness swallowed the forest, and the fog rolled in unexpectedly, thick and damp. I tried to sleep in a Jeep, but I couldn't. Shapes moved at the edge of my headlights. Tall, skeletal, jerking in ways no human body should. Hollow eyes fixed on me, unblinking, silent. I pressed the accelerator, trying to escape, but every turn led me back to the same spot. Panic clawed at my chest. By midnight, I decided to abandon the Jeep and move on foot. Branches clawed at my jacket, roots grabbed my boots, mud sucked at my legs. The whispering grew louder, forming words I didn't understand. I stumbled upon a small cabin I hadn't seen before. The roof sagged, windows dark, and walls covered in symbols scratched deep into the wood. I entered, desperate for shelter, and froze. Something crouched in the corner. At first, I thought it was human. Then I saw the limbs, too long, jointed wrong, the head tilting unnaturally. Hollow black eyes studied me. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. My instinct screamed to run. I bolted outside. The forest seemed to pulse, shadows moving in the fog, closing in. I ran blindly, stumbling, slipping in mud, following the creek I hoped would lead to safety. Hours passed, or maybe days. I can't be certain. Exhaustion blurred time. Eventually, I saw a faint road through the fog. Headlights approached. I ran toward them, collapsing into the passenger seat of a passing truck, shaking, covered in mud and blood, babbling about shadows, whispers, and the cabin. The driver stared silently, unsure what to say. I never returned to Widow's Bluff. I sold the Jeep, quit off-roading, and avoided the woods entirely. But some nights when the house is quiet and dark, I hear the whispers again. I see shadows at the edge of my vision. And I know the forest waits. It doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. I've tried to warn others. Some laugh, some dismiss it as a hallucination. I don't blame them. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. The forest is alive, watching, and patient. It's waiting for the next person who thinks they can conquer it. I can never go back, not because of fear, but because I know what waits there. And one day, it will come for me, no matter where I go.
More unexplained horrors coming soon. Subscribe to stay updated.